Welcome back to AP U.S. History. This is part two of the slavery chapter. We've been looking at why slavery grew in the United States, primarily because of the cotton gin, a cheaper way to extract cotton seeds, and it's going to be more profitable, and we're going to supply most of the cotton in the world. Certainly, slaves were mistreated, um, but to the Southerners, a valuable asset. There was a high cost of keeping slaves from escaping. There were slave patrols. Southerners created black codes to discriminate against blacks so that they couldn't read and write and had no legal standing in the courts. If you were a runaway, oftentimes a foot or a toe would be cut off and whipped to keep you in line and to intimidate other slaves from doing the same. So it's not a very pleasant experience. Slaves are deprived of their basic dignity and self-worth. Many slaves attempted to escape, but very few were successful. How slaves got back at the owners, they a lot of times sabotaged the equipment and crops. Because of the physical and psychological abuse, many slaves were convinced that they were inferior to whites. But there were actually very few who escaped to freedom. Even if they got to the North, they were never treated as equals in the white community. The slave resistance, refusal to do hard work. There were some isolated acts of sabotage. Escape through the Underground Railroad, that is, people trying to help slaves move from the South to the North and then eventually to Canada. Runaway slave ads, certainly there were rewards posted, and the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced. People would go and try to retrieve the slaves. Sometimes there were patterns, secret messages. The monkey wrench pattern on the left alerted escapees to gather up tools and prepare to flee. The drunkard path design on the right warned escapees not to follow a straight route. Slave resistance and uprising, there were some. Notable one, Stono Rebellion, was the first in 1739 of any size. It occurred in South Carolina. Slaves tried to escape to Florida, which was under Spanish control, and they promised freedom there. Whites were killed. The escape failed, and blacks were hanged because of it. Gabriel Prosser in 1800 was hatching a plan to have a slave revolt, recruited 150 men. The plot was discovered and never occurred, and 26 of the conspirators were hanged. So these were Denmark Vesey was another potential uprising that was discovered, and the perpetrators were punished. Denmark Vesey in 1822, in a slave informant advised his master of the plot. Vesey and 30 others publicly hanged. So there were some attempts, but all of them are going to end in failure. Now, the most notable revolt was Nat Turner in 1831. This is going to be in Virginia. About 60 white people, mostly women and children, are killed. This was the last revolt in the South. In fact, any more talk of emancipation or freeing the slaves comes to an end in 1831. They just feel that it's encouraging people, slaves, to resist, revolt, and so there's not going to be more talk of that in the South, at least publicly or winning any kind of support. The rebellion was eventually put down, and 100 slaves were hanged with Turner. And as a result, more harsh laws are passed in the South. This gripped in paranoia of a slave revolt. So 1831 is a significant revolt because of the way the South reacts to it, and that they're going to have a lot more controls put on slaves. In terms of free blacks, there were some, 250,000 in the South by 1860. Some owned property. In fact, some even owned slaves themselves. Some had purchased their freedom. Some were set free because they had white fathers, mulatto children. You could not vote and you could not testify in court. You had essentially no rights. And the law prohibited free blacks from certain occupations. Free blacks faced a huge amount of discrimination. Some states forbade children, black children, from public education, and free blacks were certainly segregated away from the white population. In the North, free blacks were hated by the Irish, whom they competed for jobs. Some races feeling stronger in the North than in the South. Then we have the abolitionist movement coming along, trying to free the slaves. This movement starts in the North, particularly in Pennsylvania, by the Quakers, to end slavery. In 1816, the American Colonization Society was formed. This was an idea of gradual and voluntary emancipation of slaves and sending them back to Africa, Liberia. Here's an anti-slavery alphabet created by the abolitionist. The first abolition movement, of course, the Quakers. This is before the Revolutionary War. The American Colonization Society, again founded in 1817. It was supposed to be a practical way of removing slaves from American society, and found some support among Southerners, a lot more support among Northerners. And they were going to send blacks back to Africa, Liberia. Some were afraid that there was too many blacks in America. So Liberia and West Africa was going to be the recipient of these slaves. About 15,000 were sent there. No real anti-slavery sentiment in the North in the 1820s and 30s. There were some gradualists, and then there were the immediatists. The gradualists said, well, let's just take some time to get rid of slavery in America, and those like Garrison will call for immediate end of slavery. And this is going to be over 4 decades that these 15,000 free blacks are sent back. Most U.S. blacks were not eager to go. Most of them had no real contact with Africa. They're several generations removed from that. By 1860, virtually all Southern slaves were native-born Americans. The colonization ideal appealed to Abraham Lincoln, who felt that blacks and whites could never really coexist peacefully in a free society. Some feared the mongrelization of the races, that is, mixing of white and black. Others thought the blacks were inferior and would degrade the society. The abolitionists became the most dominant reform movement in the antebellum or pre-Civil War to remove slavery. The Great Awakening convinced many abolitionists that slavery was a sin. Abolition inspired the British to free West Indian slaves in 1833. So they're going to remove it from their entire empire. It's going to take a lot longer for the United States to get to that same point. Some radical abolitionists. Somebody that you will have to know at the top of the list is William Lloyd Garrison. He operated the Liberator in Boston, and it called for the immediate end of slavery. He believed it was a sin. He believed it was a blight on America and needed to be ended. Because of his views, many Southerners believed that he was inspiring revolts, particularly the Nat Turner revolt in 1831. They had a price on his head if he could be taken back to the South. You can see here in the diagram that the abolitionists see slavery as an oppressive institution, a brutal, sinful thing. There is no middle ground. Get rid of it immediately. The paper symbolized the beginning of the abolitionist movement, but they had been around for a while. It's a wicked. They see the South as wicked and the North as virtuous. Of course, not quite as clear as that. There was certainly a lot of bad things going on in the North in terms of treatment of blacks. The inspired abolitionists formed the Anti-Slavery Society. American Anti-Slavery Society is going to be led by a man named Theodore Dwight Weld, somebody to remember. He is going to marry one of the Grimke sisters, but he was a leading advocate and architect for the end of slavery in America. Weld evangelized Charles Finney and the New York Burnover District. Of course, Charles Finney was part of that, a spokesman for the Great Awakening, seeing it as something evil. Weld wrote The American Slavery as It Is in 1839 and strongly condemned slavery, which upset a lot of Southerners. Angela Grimke is the woman that he married, who was an abolitionist in the South. Wendell Phillips is another product of the Great Awakening. He pushed for the emancipation of slaves during the Civil War. Followed by Garrison, but became more publicly practical in the 1860s. Angela and Sarah Grimke are going to be the few spokespersons in the South calling for the end of slavery. They are Southern women calling for an end to the institution. They also were involved in women's rights. Arthur and Louis Tappan, wealthy men who were against slavery and supported the Liberator and the Anti-Slavery Society. David Walker wrote the Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1829, calling for an end of slavery. Here's some prominent abolitionists. James Birney found the Literary Party and run in 1840 and 1844 and called for an end to slavery. Here's the black abolitionist David Walker. Appeal to the colored citizens of the world, fight for freedom rather than to wait to be set free by whites. So David Walker is a black man, a spokesman for the blacks and calling for abolitionist movement. Certainly advocating into slavery. And we'll stop right there and we'll continue this in part 3.